The Nevada desert stretched toward infinity, a canvas of sand and stone, baked under a sun that seemed to have forgotten mercy. From the air, the Doctrine Initiative compound appeared as nothing more than an arrangement of solar arrays and weather-beaten concrete structures, one more forgotten relic from the Cold War era, when humanity built monuments to paranoia and called them progress. The casual observer, if any existed in this desolate corner of the world, would see only the mundane infrastructure of some abandoned research facility slowly surrendering to the elements. But 300 feet beneath that cracked and bleached earth, carved into living stone, with technology that predated the catastrophe, a different reality thrived. 4,000 souls moved through chambers that hummed with purpose and conviction. They were the faithful, the chosen, the ones who remembered what the world had tried to forget. They prepared for war against an enemy they had been taught to hate with the fervor of religious certainty, an enemy they believed represented humanity's greatest sin. In the primary briefing room, holographic light painted shadows across four faces that shared blood and burden. Thorne Ashcroft stood before the tactical display with the bearing of a monument to unwavering conviction. At 34, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had never questioned an order, never doubted a doctrine, never permitted the corrosive luxury of uncertainty to compromise her purpose. Her skin held the deep reddish brown of sun-baked Arizona clay, and her eyes burned with the kind of absolute faith that had launched crusades and toppled empires throughout human history. Every crease in her doctrine uniform was sharp enough to draw blood, every movement precise as a surgical incision. She wore authority like armor, and beneath that armor, a heart that believed unshakably in the righteousness of their cause. The holographic projection before her displayed a face that had guided the doctrine for 3 decades. Morrison's silver beard and steel-gray eyes projected the gravitas of a prophet who had long ago stopped distinguishing between conviction and truth. He had transformed the doctrine from a fringe collection of conspiracy theorists meeting in desert tents into a paramilitary organization with reach across 3 continents and influence in shadows where governments feared to look. His voice when he spoke carried the weight of someone who had never entertained the possibility of being wrong. Arc 7 has maintained radio silence for 100 years. Morrison intoned each word measured and deliberate, carved from granite certainty. Our intelligence networks confirm that the entity within still lives, still guards the abomination that brought the breach upon humanity, still protects the very technology that tore our world apart and left us clinging to the ruins of civilization. Behind Thorne, her 3 sisters stood in perfect formation, each one a weapon honed for different but complementary purposes. Lyra Ashford, youngest of the 4 at 28, stood with her arms crossed over her chest, violet eyes fixed on the hologram, but her thoughts drifting somewhere else entirely to questions she had learned long ago not to voice aloud. Her black hair fell past her shoulders in a straight cascade that caught the holographic light and seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it. There was something in her posture that spoke of uncertainty, carefully concealed of internal conflicts, buried beneath layers of training and conditioning. As an empath, she experienced the emotional currents in any room, like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Right now, she felt iron conviction radiating from Thorne, cold analytical calculation from Kira, eager anticipation from Vex. But from herself, only a gnawing unease she could neither name nor dismiss, a dissonance between what she had been taught and what she felt in the deepest parts of herself. Kira Hartwell, 30 years old, possessed skin so pale it seemed to absorb the holographic light rather than reflect it, giving her an almost ethereal quality in the blue glow of the projection. Her platinum hair was cut in a short, practical style that required no maintenance, and her fingers never stopped moving, constantly dancing across the advanced interface built into her forearm like a pianist practicing scales. She existed 3 steps ahead of every conversation, running probability matrices in real-time, calculating breach points and defensive responses, wargaming scenarios, even as they were being discussed. To Kira, every mission was ultimately a puzzle to be solved through elegant code and decisive action, a mathematical problem waiting for the correct algorithm. Vex Sterling looked like she had been carved from scar tissue, stubbornness, and weaponized competence. At 32, her body was a roadmap of violence survived and lessons learned in blood. Her skin was tan dark from years spent in combat zones, where the sun was just one more enemy to endure, and her eyes constantly scanned for threats, with the wariness of someone who had survived because she never stopped being vigilant. She stood with the coiled readiness of a weapon waiting to be drawn and deployed. Vex did not question missions. She executed them with brutal efficiency and moved on to the next one. The Guardian, Morrison continued, his voice dropping into the register reserved for pronouncing damnation, has had a full century to fortify his position. Our previous reconnaissance teams vanished without trace or transmission. No bodies recovered, no evidence of their fate. But you four are not reconnaissances, you are not negotiators. You are judgment incarnate. The hologram shifted and expanded, revealing a three-dimensional schematic of ARC-7 rendered in meticulous detail. The structure looked like a massive pearl buried deep in the Colorado mountains, its chambers spiraling inward in a pattern that seemed almost organic, as if the facility had grown rather than been constructed. The architecture possessed a beauty that seemed almost alien in its perfection, suggesting minds that understood space and structure on levels beyond conventional engineering. The doctrine has spent 4 generations preparing for this moment, Morrison said, his voice assuming the cadence of sermon. Since 1953, when our founders first discovered the truth, we have known that the ARC network represents humanity's greatest sin, the hubris of attempting to preserve what should have been allowed to die with dignity, the arrogance of creating guardians to protect knowledge that brought the void upon us like divine retribution for our presumption. Lyra felt her stomach tighten into a knot of discomfort. She had heard these words her entire life, recited like sacred scripture in the underground chapels where doctrine children learned to hate what they did not understand, to fear what they had never seen, to kill for a cause they accepted on faith alone. But standing here now, mere hours away from executing a man she had never met for crimes committed before her grandparents drew breath, the familiar words felt hollow, felt wrong in ways she could not articulate even to herself. She said nothing. Silence was safer than doubt. Intelligence analysis suggests the Guardian maintains minimal automated defenses, Kira reported in a flat professional tone that conveyed information without emotional investment. The teleportation breach will deposit us directly in the central chamber, bypassing all exterior security protocols. Estimated resistance low. The entity has been isolated for 100 years. Extended solitude breeds psychological deterioration and tactical weakness. We should encounter a target compromised by his own loneliness. Thorne turned to face her sisters directly, her expression carved from granite conviction. This is not assassination, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. This is sacred duty. The Guardian made his choice when he volunteered to protect the very technology that tore reality apart in 1947. He is complicit in the greatest crime ever committed against humanity. He is guilty of preserving the means of our destruction, and he will answer for his sins before he is granted the mercy of oblivion. Yes, Commander, Vex responded immediately. Her hand already moving to rest on the plasma rifle mag-locked to her thigh muscle memory of 1,000 previous missions. Kira nodded once sharply, her fingers still dancing across her interface as she ran final equipment checks in verified encryption protocols. Lyra hesitated for just a heartbeat, a fraction of a second, that felt like an eternity before adding her voice to the chorus. Yes, Commander. Thorne's eyes found Lyra's across the briefing room, and for a moment that stretched between them, the older sister's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I know you feel things we cannot, Ira, she said quietly, her voice losing some of its command edge. I know your gift makes you question, makes you doubt, makes you vulnerable to the pain of others. But you must remember, this truth, empathy for evil, is not virtue. It is weakness that the enemy will exploit. The Guardian has had 100 years to surrender, to repent, to seek redemption. He chose defiance. He chose to continue protecting the abomination. We give him what his choices have earned. Morrison's holographic face filled the display one final time, his expression stern, but somehow satisfied, like a general watching pieces move exactly as planned. You are authorized to use any force necessary. ARC-7 must be cleansed from this earth. The Guardian must fall. The technology must be destroyed. Go with the doctrine's blessing, and may your faith guide your hands to righteous purpose. The hologram died, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the dull red glow of emergency lighting that painted everything the color of old blood. Thorne moved toward the equipment bay with the decisive stride of someone who had never second-guessed a mission. Her sisters fell into step behind her muscle memory, and years of training creating a formation as natural as breathing. They geared up in practiced silence, each woman checking weapons and equipment with the efficiency of soldiers who had performed these rituals 1,000 times before. Plasma rifles capable of superheating matter to stellar temperatures. Kinetic charges that could punch through reinforced concrete. EMP grenades designed to disable any electronic system. Enough concentrated firepower to level a city block and salt the earth where it stood. The teleportation chamber hummed with barely contained energy, its curved walls lined with technology salvaged from Arc 1 during a violent raid 15 years prior. The Doctrine had paid for that technology with the blood of 200 operatives, good men and women who had died believing they were securing humanity's future. They had learned to weaponize it by studying the broken corpses of scientists who refused to betray their oaths, even under interrogation, that redefined the boundaries of human endurance. The four sisters stepped onto the circular platform, assuming a diamond formation that had become second nature. Thorn at the point, the tip of the spear. Vex and Kira at the wings covering flanks and providing tactical support. Lyra at the rear, ready to deploy her empathic abilities for reconnaissance and psychological warfare. The technicians worked the controls with reverent concentration, and the air began to taste like copper and ozone like electricity before a lightning strike. For the Doctrine, Thorn intoned, her voice steady and sure. For humanity, her sisters replied in unison. Reality bent around them like light through distorted glass, broke like frozen water under pressure, tore like fabric pulled beyond its tensile strength, and then they were somewhere else entirely. The transition from Nevada heat to Colorado silence was so abrupt it felt like plunging through ice into deep water. One moment the familiar hum of the teleportation chamber and the weight of expectation. The next a space so vast it seemed to have its own gravity, its own atmosphere, its own rules for how reality should behave. The central chamber of Arc 7 was a cathedral built by minds that had learned to fold space and time, like origami masters working with dimensions instead of paper. The walls were constructed from a material that seemed to exist somewhere between pearl and crystal, and something that had no equivalent in human language or experience. They glowed with a soft internal luminescence that cast no shadows, creating an illumination that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, as if light itself had learned to exist without a source. The ceiling arched upward into darkness that suggested depths and heights that defied the mountain above, spaces that might extend into dimensions the human eye could not properly perceive. And in the center of this impossible space, elevated on a simple raised dais of the same pearlescent material, sat a man in a chair. Ethan Cross looked like he had been waiting for them his entire life, which in the most literal sense possible he had. He was not restrained, no chains bound his wrists or ankles, no force fields shimmered around him, no visible security systems tracked his movements. He simply sat perfectly still and at ease in a high-backed chair that appeared to have been grown from the same material as the wall's organic architecture, responding to organic need. He wore an open tactical vest over a bare sculpted chest, revealing skin covered in intricate tattoos that mapped star systems that had not been visible from Earth in thousands of years, constellations that predated recorded human history. His dark hair was cut short in precise military regulation from an era when such things still mattered. His face held the kind of profound calm that came only from having made complete peace with mortality long ago. As the four sisters materialized in perfect combat formation, weapons raised and humming with lethal promise, Ethan slowly lifted his head. His eyes, brown and deeply human, yet somehow ancient beyond measure, met each of theirs in turn. They were eyes that had watched the stars turn in their courses for a century of solitude. Eyes that had forgotten what another human face looked like, what another human voice sounded like, what human touch felt like. Eyes that held patience and sorrow, and something that might have been hope, carefully preserved against all evidence. And then he smiled. Not a cruel smile designed to provoke, not a mocking smile meant to diminish, just a small, genuine expression of something that might have been profound relief mixed with weary acceptance. "Who goes first?" he asked. His voice was calm, clear, conversational. It carried perfectly in the immense space without any echo, as if the walls themselves had been acoustically designed to amplify and clarify human speech. There was no fear in his tone, no anger or resentment, just genuine curiosity, and perhaps underlying everything else, a note of profound loneliness finally acknowledges after being denied for so long, it had become invisible even to himself. The silence that followed his question was heavier than the entire mountain pressing down above them. Thorn felt rage bloom in her chest like a dark and poisonous flower. This was defiance on a scale her zealous heart could not begin to comprehend. This was not the cowering fear of the corrupt finally brought to justice. This was not the desperate violence of the guilty cornered and fighting for survival. This was something else entirely, something that felt almost like mockery, wrapped in courtesy, contempt, disguised as hospitality. She took one deliberate step forward, her plasma rifle aimed with absolute precision, directly between those impossibly calm eyes. "I am Thorn Ashcroft of the Doctrine Initiative," she snarled, her voice tight with barely controlled fury that threatened to overflow its banks. "You are a relic, a remnant of humanity's darkest sin, a caretaker of abomination. You will identify yourself in this place immediately, or you will be erased from existence with all the ceremony you deserve. You have 5 seconds to comply." Ethan did not move, did not flinch or show any sign of distress. He simply watched her with those ancient, patient eyes, his small smile never wavering, never becoming cruel or dismissive. "I am Ethan Cross," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a century in conversation with silence and learned its rhythms. "And this is Arc 7, formerly designated the Colorado Sanctuary. You are not trespassing exactly. Trespassing implies ownership boundaries you are violating. Here in this place, you are simply unexpected guests arriving without the courtesy of advance notice." He rose from his chair, then the movement smooth and unhurried, almost ceremonial in its deliberation. It was a challenge wrapped in courtesy, an assertion of control disguised as hospitality. All 4 plasma rifles tracked him with absolute precision, muzzles unwavering despite the surreal nature of the confrontation. He was completely unarmed, his hands open and visible at his sides, his posture relaxed and unthreatening. He looked like a man greeting neighbors for a casual conversation, not facing his own execution. "You may lower your weapons," he continued, taking a single measured step off the dais. "You are guests for now, whatever your intentions. The Ark will not harm you unless you attempt to harm it. And I promise you with complete sincerity that attempting to harm it would be remarkably unpleasant for everyone involved. Please let us avoid unnecessary unpleasantness." "We are not guests," Thorn corrected sharply, her voice dripping with contempt that barely masked something else beneath it, something that might have been uncertainty or confusion. "We are judgment incarnate. We are the reckoning you have avoided for 100 years of cowardice. You and this abomination you guard have one purpose remaining in this universe: to serve as examples of what happens when humanity forgets its proper place in the natural order." Ethan's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been sadness or pity crossing his weathered features. "Then your judgment is founded on incomplete data," he said gently without condescension. "I am granting you limited access to the outer sectors of the Ark. Consider it a professional courtesy from one guardian to another, however you may misunderstand our respective roles. You will find guest quarters equipped with atmospheric processors, food synthesizers, everything necessary for comfort. You may remain for one full cycle, 24 hours, to learn what you came here believing you already knew with certainty. After that period concludes, you will leave this system voluntarily. You are in no position whatsoever to make demands," Thorn hissed, taking another aggressive step forward, her finger tightening fractionally on the trigger. "And you," Ethan said, his tone remaining perfectly level and calm, perfectly reasonable, "are in no position to understand where you are or what you have walked into. Not yet, but you will." Then he did something that left even Thorn momentarily speechless, her tactical mind struggling to process the implications. He turned his back on them. 4 trained killers with advanced weapons raised and armed fingers on triggers, and he simply turned away and walked toward a wall that dissolved into an archway of pure light, at his approach responding to his presence like a living thing recognizing its master. He paused at the threshold of light and spoke without turning around, without looking back at the weapons when aimed at his unprotected spine. Lyra, he said, the name hanging in the air, like a perfectly unexpected musical note, clear and deliberate. Lyra Ashford felt her heart stop beating for one impossible moment. He knew her name. He had not been scanned or interrogated. He could not possibly have known. There had been no information leak from the Doctrine, no time for reconnaissance or intelligence gathering. The Ark's systems had been sealed and isolated for a full century. It was absolutely fundamentally impossible for him to know her name. Your commander will want a comprehensive report on my weaknesses, Ethan continued, still not looking back, still speaking to the wall of light before him. Come, let us not keep her waiting any longer than necessary. Then he stepped through the archway and vanished into luminescence that swallowed him completely. Thorne's mind raced through tactical scenarios and threat assessments. Trap, obviously a trap. The kind of obvious trap that only worked because it was so blatant it seemed like it had to be something else, some more sophisticated deception. Or madness, genuine psychological breakdown after a century of isolation. A broken mind that had finally surrendered to delusion and now invited its own destruction. Either interpretation represented an opportunity that could not be ignored. Go, she commanded Lyra, her voice hardening back into command authority. Use your gift. Tear his mind apart piece by piece. Find the command codes for this facility. Learn the access protocols. I want to know what gives a dead civilization's guard dog such misplaced arrogance. Lyra hesitated, her violet eyes locked on the archway where Ethan had disappeared into light. She felt something alien and unfamiliar trembling in her chest, something she could not quite name. Not fear exactly, something deeper and more complicated. A curiosity that felt almost like hunger, a need to understand that transcended mission parameters. Now, sister, Thorne said, her voice softening fractionally, but losing none of its commanding edge. Lyra gave a curt professional nod, maglocked her plasma rifle to her back with practiced efficiency, and followed the Guardian into the light, stepping through the archway into the unknown. The room Ethan led her to was smaller, more intimate, designed for conversation rather than confrontation. It contained only 2 chairs facing each other across perhaps 6 feet of empty space. The air was noticeably colder here, recycled through systems that had been running for a century, and it carried the faint, clean scent of energized circuits in ozone. The walls maintained the same pearlescent glow as the central chamber, but dimmer here, softer, almost gentle. There was nothing else in this space except the omnipresent hum of the station systems and the man who was its beating heart, its purpose, its reason for existing. Ethan settled into one of the chairs with the ease of someone sitting down for meditation or prayer, a ritual performed so many times it had become instinctive. He closed his eyes, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his breathing slow and measured and perfectly controlled. He looked for all the world like a man preparing for spiritual contemplation, not psychological violation. You may begin when you are ready, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I will not resist your examination. Lyra stood before him, every fiber of her extensive training warring with the profound wrongness of the situation confronting her. Her entire life had been devoted to learning how to be a scalpel, a precision instrument designed to slice into minds and extract necessary information while leaving calculated psychological ruin in her wake. She was the Doctrine's most effective interrogator, precisely because she could make people want to tell her their deepest secrets, could make the violation feel almost voluntary, almost welcome. She was a weapon designed to turn consciousness against itself. But this man was offering his throat, willingly inviting the blade. She slowly lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her body remaining tense and ready, despite the apparent safety of the situation, her mind already reaching out with practiced tendrils of psychic energy. She touched the surface of his consciousness with delicate precision, bracing herself for shields and traps, for psychic defenses and countermeasures, for the kind of mental maelstrom that would test every defensive technique she had mastered. She found nothing, only an open door, and on the other side of that door, an ocean without boundaries. She stepped through the threshold of his mind and immediately drowned. It was not a valiant flood designed to overwhelm her defenses. It was absolute, complete immersion in experience. She was suddenly standing on a beach she had never seen, with her physical eyes feeling sand beneath bare feet. She did not possess tasting salt air that did not exist in the recycled atmosphere of Arc 7. hearing waves crash against a shore that had been consumed by the void 70 years before she was born. The sun was warm on skin that was not hers, and the sky above stretched in a blue so pure and perfect it physically hurt to witness. This was Earth, Mom. Before the breach, before the catastrophe, before everything changed forever. The memory shifted and flowed like water, carrying her helplessly along its current. She saw forests so thick with green life they seemed to pulse with vitality, felt rain on her face that tasted like growth and renewal, heard birds singing complex songs that no living human had heard in 3 generations. She felt rough bark beneath her fingertips, smelled soil rich with the scent of decay, and new growth intermingled, tasted strawberries picked fresh and still warm from summer sun that seemed impossible now. Then she saw the woman who had been the center of Ethan's universe. Her name had been Stella, and she had loved Ethan Cross with a fierceness that made Lyra's chest physically ache with longing she had never been permitted to feel. Stella's face was soft with genuine affection, her eyes bright with shared humor and intimate understanding, her hands gentle as they touched Ethan's face with the familiarity of long love. Lyra felt the kiss they shared as if it were her own lips meeting his. Tasted Stella's mouth, felt the electric thrill of connection so deep it seemed to fuse 2 souls into one inseparable being. And then with brutal suddenness, she felt Stella die. The breach had taken her in 1947 during the first devastating wave when no one understood what was happening, when the world still thought in terms of conventional threats. One moment Stella was laughing in their small apartment in Denver, discussing plans for the weekend, for the future, for the life they would build together. The next moment she was simply gone, erased from reality, as the void swept through the city like a tsunami of anti-existence, unmaking everything in its path. Ethan had been at the military research base 40 miles away, safe behind experimental shielding that barely protected against forces no one yet understood. He had watched Denver vanish on satellite feeds, watched the city unmake itself in real time, and known with absolute crystalline certainty that Stella was gone, consumed, erased, unmade from the fabric of reality itself. The grief was not metaphorical. It was literal, physical, a crushing weight that compressed Lyra's chest until she could not draw a breath, could not think, could only feel the absolute devastation of losing the one person who made existence bearable. She gasped and tried desperately to pull away from the torrent, but the current of memory was too strong, too encompassing. She felt Ethan volunteer for the Guardian program in 1952, felt him walk into the time stasis chamber, knowing with complete certainty that he would likely never leave it, that he was trading his humanity for a purpose he hoped might justify Stella's random, senseless death. She felt the crushing loneliness of the first year when he still counted days, obsessively marking time like a prisoner. The hollow acceptance that settled over him in the 10th year when he finally stopped counting because the numbers had lost all meaning. The strange, terrible peace of the 50th year when he realized he was no longer quite human in the way he had been, but something else, something patient and eternal and profoundly devastatingly alone. 100 years of silence, 100 years of watching the stars turn slowly on monitors while maintaining systems that preserved humanity's collective knowledge. 100 years of speaking to no one but the Ark's AI, of touching nothing but cold metal and crystal, of experiencing nothing but duty and memory, and the slow erosion of everything that had once made him fully human. And underneath it all, running like a thread through every year, every day, every endless hour, was hope. Fragile, stubborn, ridiculous hope that somehow, someday his sacrifice would matter. That maybe the knowledge he protected would save someone somewhere at some point in a future he would never see. That Stella's death in his lonely vigil might mean something beyond random cruelty and cosmic indifference. Lyra saw herself through his eyes, saw the moment when the 4 sisters materialized in his chamber. She felt his heart leap with something that was not fear, but profound relief, so intense it was almost painful. After 100 years of isolation, he was not alone. Even if they came to kill him, even if this was the end, he was not alone. Someone had finally found him. The totality of it was too much for any single consciousness to contain. It was everything. It was a complete human life, a civilization's legacy, a century of accumulated experience and loss and stubborn endurance poured directly into her unprepared mind. She was not built to hold this much. No one was. She gasped a raw and strangled sound that echoed in the quiet room and ripped her consciousness away from his with the psychic equivalent of tearing off her own arm. The separation was violent and desperate. She found herself on her knees on the cold floor, her body trembling uncontrollably, her mind reeling from the aftershocks of a billion alien sensations that were not alien at all, just human so deeply and completely human that they shattered every assumption she had been carefully taught. Ethan opened his eyes slowly. They were filled with an ancient sadness that had been his only constant companion for longer than Lyra had been alive, longer than her parents had been alive. "I know," he said softly, his voice carrying a compassion so genuine and unconditional, it was more devastating than any psychic attack could ever be. "It is a lot to carry. I am sorry you had to bear it." Lyra's hands shook violently as she pressed them against the cold floor, trying desperately to ground herself in something solid, something real and present. Her training, her conditioning, her entire carefully constructed identity had been built on the foundational premise of human superiority, corrupted by dangerous technology of cold logic, defeating warm chaos of the doctrine's righteous mission to cleanse the poison from humanity's self-inflicted wound. In a single overwhelming moment, this lonely man had shown her a universe of authentic feeling that made her entire existence seem like a pale shadow, a half-life lived in service to comfortable lies. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, cutting through the carefully maintained mask she had worn since childhood. She had not cried since she was 6 years old, when the doctrine trainers had systematically broken her of that weakness through methods she still could not fully remember. But here now, kneeling on the floor of an impossible room before a man who had been alone longer than she had been alive, she could not stop the tears from coming. Ethan did not move from his meditative position, did not speak or offer empty comfort. He simply sat in his chair, hands still resting peacefully on his knees, giving her the space and time to break completely without judgment or pressure. Outside this small room in the vast central chamber, Thorne Ashcroft's legendary patience had finally evaporated like water on hot stone. Hours had passed with no word from Lyra, no status updates, no communication, just silence that grew heavier with each passing minute. Kira's increasingly desperate scans of the Ark's systems were proving utterly useless, the walls constructed from self-repairing exotic matter that defied every analytical technique in their considerable arsenal. Every sophisticated attempt to hack into the facility's computer systems met a passive but completely impenetrable wall of logic that simply absorbed the intrusion attempts and rendered them irrelevant, like a vast ocean swallowing raindrops. "Enough of this pointless game," Thorne's voice echoed through their private encrypted comm channel, sharp with frustration and barely suppressed fury. "Vex, you have your orders. The relic is hiding his access controls somewhere in the central core. A kinetic assault will bypass whatever exotic energy shielding he has deployed. Breach the vault. Now." "Acknowledged, Commander," Vex rasped back, already moving with a lethal purpose toward the massive reinforced doors at the far end of the chamber. In a small side monitoring room that Ethan had not bothered to secure or even acknowledge, subtle alarms began chiming with soft insistence. On a holographic display that erupted smoothly from the floor in response to the threat assessment, he watched a detailed schematic showing Vex's approach vector and tactical formation. He sighed deeply, a sound of genuine regret for what was about to become necessary. Lyra, who had finally composed herself enough to sit upright, though her eyes were still red and swollen from crying, looked at him with an expression mixing alarm and confusion. "They will try to destroy everything," she whispered, her voice still hoarse from the emotional devastation of their connection. "No," Ethan said, and beneath his calm exterior she detected steel tempered by a century of patient purpose. "They will not succeed. The Ark is not a weapon in any conventional sense. It is a guardian, and guardians, true guardians, are exceptionally good at stopping people from hurting themselves and others." He placed his palm flat on a smooth control surface, and the pearlescent walls of the entire facility pulsed with golden light that flowed through the structure like blood through veins. Vex Sterling reached the core's blast doors, accompanied by her complement of automated combat drones, heavy weapons platforms that doctrine engineers had been perfecting for decades. The doors themselves were impossibly thick, constructed from materials that predated modern metallurgy, ancient beyond reasonable reckoning. They looked designed to withstand a direct nuclear detonation. Breaching charges set in armed, Vex reported to Thorne with professional precision. Detonating in 3, 2, 1, now! The massive explosion that should have torn the doors from their reinforced hinges was completely, utterly silent. The charges flashed with white-hot fury, releasing enough explosive force to vaporize hardened steel and pulverize concrete, but the concussive wave simply vanished into nothing. A shimmering field of localized artificial gravity had manifested exactly 1 inch from the door's surface, absorbing every single joule of explosive energy and converting it harmlessly to dispersed heat that the Ark's thermal management systems immediately recycled. Report immediately, us, Thorne demanded, her voice tight with disbelief that bordered on genuine alarm. Charges had no measurable effect whatsoever. Vex stated flatly, her professional composure cracking slightly to reveal genuine bewilderment underneath. Switching to plasma cutting systems. Brilliant white-hot beams lanced out from the combat drones. Energy weapons operating at temperatures that could cut through battleship armor plating like butter. But the wall section directly in front of them seemed to ripple and shift its molecular structure, transforming in real-time response to the threat. The superheated plasma beams passed completely harmlessly through what had suddenly become a transparent section of wall and dissipated uselessly against the far side of the corridor beyond. The moment Vex's system ceased firing, the wall solidified again in its original configuration, completely unscathed and unmarred. "This is impossible," Kira breathed over the comm channel from her remote monitoring station, her analytical mind struggling desperately to process the implications. They are actively manipulating space-time itself at a localized level. The energy requirements alone should be astronomical. The computational complexity is beyond anything we have theoretical models for. They are rewriting physics in real time. "Continue firing," Thorne ordered, fury making her voice shake with barely controlled rage. "All weapons, maximum sustained barrage." As Vex's entire complement of combat systems unleashed a coordinated volley of plasma bolts, kinetic penetrators, and experimental energy weapons, the very architecture of Arc-7 came alive with elegant, almost playful precision. Sections of the floor smoothly lowered themselves, creating impassable chasms that forced the combat drones to reroute their attack vectors. Walls slid into new configurations with the quiet efficiency of well-maintained machinery, creating a constantly shifting maze that funneled the assault team into harmless loops that led nowhere. Gravity fields reversed polarity in specific locations, sending kinetic rounds back toward their points of origin with perfect mirror trajectories. And then came the mist. A fine silvery vapor filled the corridor like morning fog rolling in from the sea, beautiful and mesmerizing in the way certain poisons possess terrible beauty. It was a coordinated swarm of millions of microscopic nanite machines, each one moving with unified purpose, directed by the Ark's central intelligence. But these were not the flesh-eating plague nanites of doctrine, propaganda, and apocalyptic literature. They were something far more sophisticated and elegant. The nanite swarm flowed over Vex's advanced weapons like mercury over glass, and with delicate, almost surgical precision, they began systematically disassembling the plasma rifles and kinetic cannons into their component parts. Bolts unscrewed themselves with perfect mechanical efficiency. Power cells disconnected cleanly from their housings. Trigger assemblies separated into constituent components. Circuit boards lifted free from their mountings. Within approximately 2 minutes of contact, the corridor floor was littered with neat, organized piles of completely useless metal polymer and electronic components arranged with almost artistic care, as if on display in a museum. Vex Sterling and her squadron of combat drones stood in the shifting maze completely and utterly disarmed, without a single scratch or injury on any biological component. The message transmitted by this precise, non-lethal response was crystal clear and impossible to misinterpret. "We possess the capability to dismantle your violence atom by atom. We choose not to harm you. Do not force us to make different choices. Do not attempt this again." The fragile truce that followed in the wake of this demonstration was born not from mutual respect or understanding, but from cold tactical necessity and undeniable reality. Thorne Ashcroft, publicly humiliated and privately seething with impotent rage, was forced by circumstances to recall her scattered troops. They were confined to the comfortable guest quarters that Ethan had originally offered them, spacious rooms equipped with sophisticated atmospheric control systems and advanced food synthesizers, all monitored constantly by the Ark's passive but utterly omniscient surveillance systems. The balance of power had shifted so completely and so rapidly that it had essentially inverted. The four sisters who had arrived as conquerors and executioners were now effectively prisoners in an elegant cage without visible bars, fed and sheltered, and protected by the very entity they had come to destroy. In her assigned quarters, Thorne sat alone in darkness. She had manually activated, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists, her tactical mind racing frantically through impossible scenarios and hopeless contingencies. Every single option she could conceive led inexorably to the same crushing conclusion: they were completely, utterly outmatched by technology, so advanced it functionally resembled magic. The Guardian had defeated them comprehensively, without raising a hand in violence, without shedding a single drop of blood, without even truly engaging in anything that could be called combat. It was the single most humiliating moment of her entire life. A defeat so absolute it called into question everything she thought she understood about power and purpose. In another set of quarters down the corridor, Lyra Ashford sat with her back pressed against the softly glowing wall, knees drawn protectively to her chest, replaying the overwhelming ocean of Ethan's memories over and over in her mind, like a recording she could not stop. She could still feel with perfect clarity the texture of sand beneath feet that were not hers, could still taste salt air that did not exist in this recycled environment, could still feel the crushing, suffocating weight of 100 years of loneliness that had carved Ethan into something simultaneously more and less than human. Everything she had been taught with absolute certainty was wrong, not just incorrect or slightly mistaken, not just misguided by good intentions, fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong in ways that called into question her entire existence and purpose. And she had absolutely no idea what to do with that devastating knowledge. In his private meditation chamber deep in the Ark's core, Ethan Cross sat in darkness that was familiar and comfortable. And for the first time in 100 years of patient waiting, he allowed himself to feel something dangerously close to hope. They had come to execute him. They had failed completely. And in the process of that failure, one of them had seen the truth buried beneath generations of carefully cultivated lies. It was a beginning, fragile, uncertain, but real. Outside the mountain, the Colorado sun set in a blaze of orange and red over peaks that held secrets deeper than stone and older than recorded memory. In the heart of Arc 7, ancient systems hummed with patient, tireless vigilance, maintaining their endless watch, waiting for a darkness that was even now, in this very moment, beginning to stir restlessly in the vast spaces between distant stars. The first day of their confrontation ended with four sisters trapped in unexpected light, one guardian still waiting, patiently in self-imposed shadow, and a truth that would shatter their entire world, still hovering unspoken in the charged air between them. But tomorrow would inevitably come, as it always did. And with tomorrow's dawn would come revelation that could not be avoided or denied. The real story was only beginning. Dawn in Arc 7 was not marked by natural sunlight breaking over mountain peaks, but by a subtle, carefully programmed shift in the pearlescent wall's internal luminescence. The glow transitioned gradually from the soft blue of simulated twilight to warm amber tones that mimicked sunrise in a world that had largely forgotten what genuine morning light looked like. It was artificial controlled programmed, but after a century, Ethan had refined it to near perfection. Lyra Ashford had not slept. She sat motionless in her assigned quarters, back pressed against walls that hummed with incomprehensible technology, replaying the previous day's psychic drowning over and over until the boundaries between Ethan's memories and her own experiences began to blur and merge in disturbing ways. She could still feel with vivid, tactile clarity the sensation of Stella's lips against Ethan's mouth, could still taste strawberries warm from a sun that no longer shone on Earth, that no longer existed, could still feel the suffocating vacuum of 100 years spent in conversation with nothing but silence and duty. Her entire carefully constructed framework for understanding reality had shattered into countless fragments, and she sat among the pieces trying to decide if she even wanted to attempt rebuilding or simply let everything stay broken. The door to her quarters chimed softly. Not a demand or intrusion, an invitation, a request. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse and rough from hours of disuse and suppressed crying. Ethan Cross stood in the doorway backlit by the amber glow of artificial morning, and in that warm light, Lyra saw him with completely different eyes than she had brought to this mission. Not as a target to be eliminated, not as a relic of humanity's darkest mistakes, but as a profoundly lonely man who had sacrificed everything conceivable to guard something he believed was worth more than his own life, his own happiness, his own humanity. "I thought you might want breakfast," he said quietly, holding a tray laden with synthesized food that looked and smelled remarkably authentic. The Ark's molecular fabrication systems are quite sophisticated at replicating things that no longer exist in nature. Pancakes, real coffee, or at least a chemical duplicate indistinguishable from the original. Fresh strawberries. Lyra's breath caught painfully in her chest. Strawberries. He knew exactly what she had experienced in his memories, what sensations had burned themselves into her consciousness. Of course he knew. The psychic connection had worked in both directions, a two-way bridge she had not fully understood when she initiated it. "You were in my mind too," she said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. "Yes," Ethan admitted, without hesitation or apology, setting the tray carefully on a small table. "Not intentionally or by design. But when you opened yourself completely to me, I could not help but see what you carried. Your training, your conditioning, the systematic way they taught you that authentic feeling was weakness to be purged. I am genuinely sorry for what they did to you, Lyra, for what they stole from you." She looked at him sharply, defensiveness rising automatically. "Do not presume to pity me." "I do not pity you," he replied, his voice gentle but absolutely firm. "I respect you deeply. There is a profound difference. You were systematically shaped to be a weapon of extraordinary precision, and you became exactly that with remarkable skill. But weapons, even the most finely crafted ones, can choose to become something else entirely. I did exactly that." He moved to the transparent section of wall that served as a window, gazing out at the mountain landscape beyond. Snow-capped peaks stretched toward a sky that seemed too gray, too empty, conspicuously missing the constant traffic of aircraft and satellites that once filled Earth's atmosphere. "I did not bring you breakfast to offer comfort or sympathy," Ethan continued thoughtfully. "I brought it because I genuinely need your help with something important. And because you came here searching desperately for truth, however much that truth might cost you. I can show you the source code of everything, the real history without propaganda or interpretation, but only if you are genuinely ready to see it, to accept what it reveals." Lyra stood slowly, every muscle in her body tense with anticipation and dread. This was the precipice, the cliff edge, the point of no return. She could walk away right now, return to her sisters, report that the Guardian was too well defended for conventional assault, recommend alternative approaches that preserved the comfortable certainty she had been raised with. Or she could step off the edge and fall into truth wherever that fall might lead. "Show me everything," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The Archive Observatory was a room that violated every principle of conventional architecture and spatial physics. The walls were not solid barriers, but windows into space itself, offering perfect, seamless transparency that made standing in the chamber feel like floating untethered in the cosmic void. Earth hung below them, a mottled gray sphere wrapped in clouds that seemed unnaturally thick and persistent, like a blanket deliberately hiding scars that still had not fully healed after 7 decades. In the precise center of the room, a holographic interface rose elegantly from the floor, like a crystalline tree growing from digital soil, its branches of pure light spreading in infinitely complex fractal patterns. Each delicate branch represented a different archive node, a different fragment of humanity's painstakingly preserved knowledge. The Ark network was never designed or intended to be a weapon, Ethan said, his voice carrying a slight echo in the vast space. It was conceived and built to be a library, a comprehensive backup drive for absolutely everything humanity had learned, created, discovered, and understood. When the breach came in 1947, we realized with absolute clarity that we were facing something that did not simply destroy bodies or buildings. It unmade information itself, erased memory, deleted knowledge, stripped away the very fabric of what made things real and distinct. He touched the holographic interface with practiced familiarity, and it responded to him like a living organism recognizing its caretaker. Branches of light swirled and reformed into entirely new patterns. A massive hologram bloomed in the empty air between them, showing Montana exactly as it had looked in the peaceful summer of 1947. "It started here," Ethan said quietly, his voice heavy with old grief. "A dimensional rift opened approximately 3 miles outside Billings, Montana. At first, our scientists thought it was some kind of unusual atmospheric phenomenon. Ball lightning, swamp gas, temperature inversion. The usual dismissive explanations for things that defy conventional understanding. But then the town started to disappear in ways that made no sense. The hologram shifted perspective, showing Billings from directly above. And then, like watching film played in eerie reverse, the town began to fade from existence. Buildings did not collapse into rubble. They simply became progressively less real, less defined, losing solidity and detail until they were nothing but faint outlines sketched in dying light, and then not even that. The people vanished through the same horrifying process, erased from existence, as if they had never been born, never lived, never mattered. The void does not consume matter or energy in any way we can conventionally understand." Ethan explained, his voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. "It consumes information itself, complexity, pattern, organization, everything that makes a specific thing unique and distinguishable from formless chaos. A building is fundamentally just atoms arranged in an intentional pattern. A human being is just cells arranged in an incomprehensibly complex pattern. The void strips away the organizing pattern and leaves behind nothing but formless potential, pure unmaking." Lyra watched in mounting horror as the hologram showed the military response to this incomprehensible threat. Fighter jets screaming overhead, dropping conventional ordnance. Tanks rolling through streets that were already half gone, firing shells at an enemy that possessed no physical form to target. Soldiers desperately firing weapons at empty air at a threat they could not see or comprehend. And then the weapons themselves began to fade, the sophisticated complexity of their construction unraveling into component atoms and finally into absolute nothing. "Denver was next," Ethan said, and his voice cracked slightly with the weight of personal grief carefully controlled. "Stella was there living her normal life. She was an elementary school teacher, 3rd grade. She loved children with remarkable passion, loved watching their minds open to new understanding. The void took her school first during morning classes. Then it spread to consume her neighborhood. Then the entire city, 2 million people, gone in less than 6 hours, not dead, which would at least grant them the dignity of having existed. Worse than dead, unmade from reality itself." The hologram showed with terrible clinical precision the expanding circle of unreality spreading like ink dropped into water. Phoenix, Seattle, Salt Lake City, Portland. One by one, the major population centers of the American West simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. "The government threw absolutely everything at it," Ethan continued, his voice hollow. "Nuclear weapons that simply unmade themselves before detonation. Biological agents that ceased to exist upon contact. Experimental technology we had been secretly developing for decades, all of it useless. You cannot fight entropy given physical form. You cannot kill something that is not alive, just endlessly, cosmically hungry." "How did it stop?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression was grim, carved from a bitter experience. "It did not stop. It paused. We discovered through desperate experimentation that the void feeds on complexity and information, but it can become temporarily sated like a biological predator, gorging itself and then sleeping to digest. In early 1948, it contracted back into the original rift point in Montana and went dormant. Our best projections suggested we had perhaps 5 years, maybe less, before it would wake again and resume consuming." He touched the interface again with practiced gestures, and the hologram shifted to show massive underground construction on an unprecedented scale. 7 sites scattered across what remained of the United States, each one a technological marvel buried deep in protective stone. "The ARC protocol was humanity's last desperate gambit," Ethan said. If we could not stop the void from eventually unmaking us completely, we could at least preserve what we had been. Every book humanity ever wrote, every song ever composed, every scientific discovery, every mathematical proof, every work of art, every recorded memory worth saving. We built 7 repositories, each one specifically designed to survive even if the void consumed the entire planet. And we built guardians to protect them through whatever came next. You, Lyra whispered, understanding, finally clicking into place. And 6 others, Ethan confirmed. We all volunteered. We stepped into time stasis chambers fully aware that we would age far slower than the world outside, knowing we would likely spend the rest of our extended lives utterly alone, watching over data that might never be accessed. But it was worth the sacrifice. Because if the void returned, if it finished what it started, maybe someone somewhere at some distant point in an uncertain future would find what we preserved. Maybe humanity would not be completely forgotten. Maybe we would not vanish without leaving any trace that we had ever existed. He turned to face her directly, and in his ancient eyes she saw the crushing weight of a century of solitude, of sacrifice so profound it had fundamentally hollowed him out and rebuilt him into something both less and more than he had been. That is what you came here to destroy, Lyra. Not a weapon, not a relic of humanity's sins. A library, a memorial. The last fragile memory of a world that died. Lyra's hands were shaking violently. But the doctrine teachings, the prophecies we were raised on, they explicitly state that the arcs brought the void upon us, that the technology itself was an abomination that tore reality apart. Then let me show you exactly where those teachings originated, Ethan said quietly. The door to the observatory opened smoothly. Kira Hartwell stood in the entrance, her pale face illuminated by the constant glow of her forearm interface. I have been monitoring the archives remotely from my quarters, she said without preamble, running comprehensive probability analyses, cross-referencing historical data. The timeline does not match doctrine teachings, not even remotely close. The arcs were definitively constructed after the breach occurred, not before. The mathematics are absolutely undeniable. She walked forward cautiously, her analytical mind clearly struggling with cognitive dissonance. Either our entire doctrinal foundation is based on fundamental lies, or this represents the most sophisticated historical deception in recorded human history. I need to see the primary evidence, the original source documents. Show me proof. Ethan nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. The archive does not lie. It cannot lie. That was integral to its core design. Every record is cryptographically time-stamped, verified through multiple independent sources, cross-referenced with corroborating evidence. But you must understand something crucial. Once you see this evidence, once you know the truth with absolute certainty, you cannot return to comfortable ignorance. That door closes permanently. Show us, Kira said, her voice cold and analytical, but underneath Lyra could sense her profound fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of having wasted her entire life in service to comfortable lies. Ethan touched the interface with deliberate care, and the hologram exploded into an overwhelming cascade of documents. Military reports stamped with classification codes, scientific analyses dense with technical data, news archives from newspapers that no longer existed, personal journals written in the desperate final days before cities vanished. Thousands upon thousands of primary sources, all meticulously time-stamped and verified, all telling precisely the same story from different perspectives. The arcs were built after the breach, not before. They were humanity's response to catastrophe, not its cause. Kira's fingers flew frantically across her interface, running verification algorithms, checking cryptographic signatures, searching with increasing desperation for any evidence of data tampering or historical manipulation. She found absolutely nothing. Every document was completely authentic. Every timestamp was verified through multiple independent systems. The mathematics were perfect and undeniable. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. No, this cannot be accurate. The doctrine has existed since 1953. We have extensive records, prophecies, founding documents that explicitly state the arcs caused the breach. Our entire organizational history. Let me show you precisely where those founding documents originated, Ethan interrupted gently. The hologram shifted again, displaying a different kind of archive entirely. Not official government records, but deeply personal data, DNA trace analysis, genetic memory markers, the kind of information that could only be accessed through profound psychic connection and genetic sequencing. Lyra, Ethan said carefully, your family has been integral to the doctrine for 4 complete generations. That genetic continuity means you carry specific markers, memory traces inherited from your direct ancestors. The archive can read those markers and reconstruct their experiences, if you consent to the process. Lyra looked at the holographic interface, feeling like she was staring into an abyss that stared back with infinite patience. Will it cause pain? No physical pain, Ethan assured her, but it will show you things your ancestors witnessed, emotions they felt, beliefs they held with absolute conviction. And once you possess that knowledge, you will have to decide what to do with it. The burden of truth is not light. She took a deep, steadying breath and placed her hand on the crystalline interface. The world exploded into inherited memory. She was no longer Lyra Ashford, trained empath and doctrine operative. She was Thomas Ashford, her great-great-grandfather, standing in a makeshift tent in the Nevada desert in the cooling autumn of 1952. He was 34 years old, a former Army intelligence officer who had lost his wife and 2 young children when the void consumed Las Vegas in the final days of the 1947 catastrophe. Around him sat 11 other desperate souls, all survivors of the breach, all carrying the hollow-eyed look of people who had lost absolutely everything and found zealous faith to fill the devastating emptiness. On a rough wooden table in the center of their gathering lay a single document. It was clearly aged, written in a complex language that Thomas did not recognize, but the Army translator who had examined it provided a rough interpretation of its contents. It appeared to be a fragment of technical documentation recovered from a crashed aircraft of completely unknown origin in the New Mexico desert in 1949. The partially translated document spoke of guardians, of sentinels who would hold precious light against consuming darkness, of knowledge carefully preserved against the inevitably coming void, of humanity's salvation resting in the dedicated hands of those who faithfully remembered. Thomas Ashford read the translated words with tears streaming down his weathered face, because here finally was concrete purpose. Here was profound meaning in the senseless horror that had consumed his beloved family. The Guardians existed. The arcs were real. Salvation was genuinely possible if they could only find the way. We must locate them, Thomas said, his voice shaking with desperate conviction. We must cleanse the corruption before it spreads. The arcs were constructed with the same technology that opened the dimensional rift. They caused this catastrophe. They are the abomination. We must destroy them before they bring the void back to finish consuming us. And the others agreed without hesitation. 11 desperate survivors, psychologically broken by incomprehensible loss, grasping desperately for any explanation that made coherent sense, any identifiable enemy. They could fight any sense of purpose that could make their suffering meaningful, rather than random. The doctrine was born in that desert tent, built on a foundation of profound grief and fundamental misunderstanding, and a translation that was 90% hopeful interpretation rather than accurate rendering. But then the memory shifted unexpectedly, and Lyra saw something the original founders had not witnessed. She saw the untranslated document before any human had attempted interpretation. She saw it with the perfect clarity of the archive's sophisticated analysis systems, and she understood with devastating certainty the words they had catastrophically misread. It was not a warning about the arcs being dangerous. It was a warning for the arcs and their guardians. Instructions left by someone, something from a civilization elsewhere. A message carefully preserved in a bottle from beings that had faced the void before in their own history and somehow survived the encounter. The sentinels will hold knowledge against the consuming emptiness. When the long dark comes again, seek the guardians. They are not your enemy. They are your only salvation. Do not destroy what you do not yet understand. Learn, remember, survive together. The founders had read Seek the Guardians and heard Destroy the Guardians, had read Not Your Enemy and assumed sophisticated deception, had built an entire religious crusade spanning generations on a misunderstanding so fundamental it would have been darkly comedic if it had not directly led to a century of violence and wasted purpose. Lyra gasped violently and pulled her hand away from the interface as if it had burned her. She collapsed to her knees on the cold floor, tears streaming freely down her face, her entire body shaking with the overwhelming weight of revelation. My family, she choked out between sobs. They were genuinely trying to help. They thought they were saving humanity, and they were completely, utterly wrong. Kira stood absolutely frozen, her inner face forgotten, and dark, her analytical mind struggling desperately to process the implications cascading through her understanding. The entire doctrine, 4 complete generations, thousands of dedicated operatives, dozens of violent raids on research facilities, hundreds dead on both sides. All of it based on a translation error, compounded by grief-driven misinterpretation. Not simply an error, Ethan said softly, kneeling beside Lyra, but not touching her, just offering quiet presence. A choice. Your ancestors consciously chose to see threat instead of hope, because hope was too psychologically painful after everything they had lost. They had lost everyone and everything they loved. Accepting that the arcs were built to prevent the void's return, not cause it, meant accepting that their loved ones died completely randomly. Cosmic horror. Meaningless chance. But if the arcs were evil, if the Guardians were actively complicit in the catastrophe, then there was someone concrete to blame, someone to fight against, purpose carved from suffering. He remained kneeling, his voice gentle. I understand them completely, Lyra. I lost Stella to the same random cruelty. I could have chosen consuming rage, could have demanded someone be held accountable and punished for the breach. Instead, I chose to become a Guardian. To make her senseless death mean something by protecting what she loved most: knowledge, learning, children's futures. Your ancestors chose differently. Neither choice was inherently wrong. They were simply profoundly human. But the prophecy, Lyra whispered desperately, it clearly said we would be allies with the Guardians. It said exactly what it meant, Ethan confirmed quietly. You and I, we are the alliance it spoke of across centuries. Not Doctrine and Guardian as perpetual enemies, but as partners, working together against the real threat that never truly went away. The door to the observatory slammed open with sudden violence. Thorne Ashcroft stood in the entrance, her face a carefully controlled mask of fury barely containing something that looked disturbingly like fear. Enough of this manipulation, she snarled with barely controlled rage. You have poisoned their minds long enough, yes, with sophisticated lies, Guardian. This ends immediately. Behind her, Vex Sterling stood holding a hastily assembled portable communication array, clearly constructed from salvaged component parts. Her scarred face was grim with determination. I have successfully contacted Morrison, Thorne said, her voice cold and absolutely certain. Informed him that the Guardian has taken you hostage through psychic weapons and manipulation. He has personally authorized Purge Protocol. The orbital strike will commence in precisely 6 hours. This entire facility will be comprehensively sterilized from space. Everything here will be reduced to atoms. Thorne, no, Lyra said, desperately struggling to her feet. You do not understand what you are doing. Everything we were systematically taught. I understand perfectly that you have been compromised. Thorne cut her off sharply. Your empathy has made you psychologically weak, made you pathetically susceptible to his carefully crafted lies and emotional manipulation. The Guardian of True Doctrine Prophecy would not be hiding like a coward in a hole. He would not be. She stopped abruptly, her voice breaking slightly, despite her iron control. He would not be this. Look at the actual evidence, Kira said urgently, her voice sharp with desperate logic. The timeline does not match doctrine teachings. The arcs were constructed after the breach occurred. The mathematics are completely undeniable. Mathematics can be systematically falsified, Thorne shot back. Holograms can be expertly manufactured. Historical records can be altered by sufficiently advanced technology. But faith cannot be corrupted by mere data. Faith is what kept our family alive and purposeful for 4 complete generations. Faith is what gives our sacred mission meaning and direction. I will not abandon it for convenient lies wrapped in technological sophistication. Ethan stood slowly, his expression remaining calm but his eyes holding new intensity born of urgency. Then you will directly murder thousands of innocent people. The orbital strike will not simply destroy Arc 7. The massive explosion will catastrophically destabilize the quantum field generators that have been keeping the Montana Rift sealed for 70 years. The void will wake from dormancy. It will consume what remains of the Western territories. Millions will die. Actual die this time not in your apocalyptic fantasies, but in screaming reality you can touch. Thorne's jaw clenched visibly. You are lying to save yourself. He is not, a new voice said from the doorway. Vex Sterling stepped forward, her expression deeply troubled. I have been systematically monitoring the Ark's defensive system since our failed assault. The quantum field generators he mentions are absolutely real. I can observe them on detailed schematics. If he is telling the truth about their function, he is not, Thorne insisted, but her voice had lost its previous absolute certainty. There is one definitive way to know for sure, Ethan said quietly. He turned to face Elira directly. The archive possesses the capability to broadcast the truth directly to every doctrine operative worldwide, every single one simultaneously. But it requires a complete fusion of consciousness, a total merging of two minds to create a unified signal strong enough to penetrate their conditioned psychological defenses. You have seen my memories. You know with absolute certainty I am not lying. But they need to see what you saw, feel what you felt, experience what you experienced. And that requires absolutely not, Thorne said sharply. The psychological risk. I will do it, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her entire body. Ethan looked at her with profound intensity. You understand completely what this means. The fusion will be permanent and irreversible. I will carry a part of you forever. You will carry a part of me. We will never be entirely separate individuals again. Our thoughts, our feelings, our very identities will be quantum entangled. This is not a temporary connection. This is, I know, Lyra said softly but firmly. I felt it in your memories. What you had with Stella. Connection so deep it transcends physical limitations. I have never experienced that. Never been allowed to even imagine it. The doctrine taught me systematically that connection was weakness. But in your mind, I felt the opposite truth. Connection was the only thing that made the universe bearable. Show me. Show them all. Let them feel what I felt. Thorne grabbed Lyra's arm, roughly, her grip tight enough to leave bruises on mortal flesh. Sister, please, think carefully about what you are doing. This could destroy you completely. You could lose yourself entirely in the process. Lyra met her older sister's eyes and saw genuine fear there. Not fear of mission failure or of being wrong, but fear of permanent loss. Fear that the little sister she had personally trained and protected and carefully shaped was about to become someone else entirely. I am already lost, Lyra said gently but firmly. I have been lost my entire life following orders, without question, suppressing authentic feelings, being exactly what you needed me to be. Maybe it is finally time I find myself, even if that means becoming someone completely new. She pulled away from Thorne's restraining grip and walked with steady determination to Ethan's side. What do I need to do? Ethan led her to the precise center of the observatory where two organic cradles rose smoothly from the floor in response to his presence, sleek shapes that looked like they had been grown rather than mechanically constructed. They faced each other across perhaps 3 feet of space, designed to hold a human body in something between sitting and reclining positions. The process is profoundly intimate, Ethan warned seriously. More intimate than anything you have experienced in your entire life. It is not violent or painful, but it is absolutely total. Every memory, every secret, every dark corner of your soul will be completely exposed, and you will see all of mine with equal clarity. There will be nothing hidden between us. Ever. Good, Lyra said, surprising herself with her own conviction. I am desperately tired of hiding from truth. She settled carefully into one cradle, feeling it adjust responsively to her body, warm and somehow alive. Ethan lowered himself into the facing cradle, and for a long moment that stretched between them, they simply looked at each other. Two people about to become something more than the sum of their parts. Thorne, Lyra said without looking away from Ethan's ancient eyes. If this works as intended, you will understand everything. You will feel what I felt. You will know the truth beyond any possibility of doubt. And if it does not work, at least I will have tried to save you from destroying yourself. Thorne stood rigid as carved stone, her face a carefully controlled mask, hiding profound turmoil, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Kira and Vex flanked her, protectively, uncertain and waiting. Ethan reached out slowly, his hand finding Lyra's across the space between the cradles. Their fingers intertwined, and even that simple touch sent a powerful jolt through her nervous system, a preview of what was coming. "Ready?" he asked softly. "Yes," she whispered. The interface hummed to life with building power. Golden light flowed up from the cradles like warm water, wrapping around them in luminous embrace, and Lyra felt a jolt that bypassed her physical senses entirely and connected directly to her consciousness. Then his mind met hers with gentle deliberation, and the universe exploded into unified awareness. It was not the overwhelming flood of their first psychic contact. This was deliberate, careful, a gentle intertwining of two separate patterns into a unified whole. She felt his loneliness, that vast, quiet sea of isolation, and she answered it with the sharp, disciplined sting of her manufactured existence. His memory of sunlight on Stella's beloved face met her memory of cold, recycled air in underground training rooms. His profound grief met her confusion about emotions she had been systematically taught not to feel. But deeper than surface memory, deeper than emotion, they found something fundamental. The core of what made each of them unique was not in conflict, but in profound harmony. His patience and her intensity. His hard-won wisdom and her fierce curiosity. His sorrow and her barely suppressed rage at a life stolen by doctrine. They were not erasing each other. They were completing each other. And together unified, they reached into the vast heart of the archive. They felt its immense distributed network, 7 technological pearls scattered across a dying continent, each one holding precious fragments of humanity's collective soul. They accessed the sophisticated communication array, the same quantum encrypted system that the doctrine uses for secure transmissions. And they broadcast truth. Every doctrine operative worldwide felt it simultaneously. Morrison and his fortified command center in Nevada, strike teams preparing for coordinated raids across 3 continents, sleeper cells carefully embedded in government facilities, training cadres indoctrinating new recruits in underground facilities. They all felt the truth pour into their minds without warning or preparation. Not as abstract words or static images, but as completely lived experience. They felt Lyra's transformative journey from absolute certainty to crushing doubt to profound revelation. They felt Ethan's century of loneliness guarding knowledge that could save them all. They felt the genetic memory of the founders, saw the catastrophic mistranslation understood with devastating clarity, the cascading error that had shaped and defined 4 generations. And they felt the love, the deep, profound, aching love that Ethan had carried for Stella, transformed through necessity into love for all humanity, for the uncertain future, for the fragile chance that his sacrifice might matter. They felt Lyra's desperate need to connect authentically, to feel without fear, to be more than a precision weapon. The broadcast lasted only 17 seconds. But in those 17 seconds, the Doctrine initiative shattered into fragments. In Nevada, Morrison collapsed at his command console, tears streaming down his weathered face as he canceled the orbital strike with shaking hands that could barely work the controls. Across the world, advanced weapons were lowered in confusion. Long-standing orders were questioned for the first time. 100 years of absolute certainty crumbled in the face of truth that could not be denied because it was not merely told, but viscerally felt. In the observatory, Lyra and Ethan slowly separated as the golden light faded, their hands, still joined fingers intertwined. The fusion was complete, permanent, irreversible. She could feel him now, a warm, bright presence in the back of her mind, and she knew with absolute certainty he felt her the same way. They would never be entirely alone again. She looked at him through eyes that held tears of relief and wonder. "I can feel you," she whispered in awe. "Always. Even when we are physically apart." "Yes," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion he had not permitted himself in a century. "Always." Thorne Ashcroft stood frozen, her face pale as death, her whole body trembling with reaction. The broadcast had reached her too. She had felt everything, seen everything, understood everything, and her carefully constructed world had ended. "Sister," Lyra said gently, rising from the cradle on unsteady legs. "Do not," Thorne whispered, her voice breaking. "Do not call me sister. I am not worthy of that bond. I led you here to murder an innocent man. I would have destroyed the archive. I would have awakened in the void. I would have killed millions. Her voice broke entirely, and for the first time in her adult life, Thorne Ashcroft, commander of the faithful, fell to her knees and wept like a broken child. Lyra knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her older sister as violent sobs racked her body. You were wrong, Lyra said softly, but you were trying to protect people. That intention was never wrong, only the method. What do we do now? Kira asked quietly, looking at the data streaming across her interface. The doctrine is dissolving. Morrison has surrendered command, but the quantum sensors are showing movement. Something is stirring in the Montana Rift. Ethan stood carefully, and Lyra felt his concern echo through their bond. The void, he said grimly. Our broadcast was a concentrated burst of complex information. We just rang the dinner bell. It is waking up. Outside the observatory's transparent walls, the gray sky over Colorado began to darken in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with weather patterns. Somewhere to the north in the cold mountains of Montana, something vast and hungry was opening its eyes after 70 years of dormant sleep. And the last sentinel, no longer alone, prepared to face the darkness with allies he had waited a century to find. The revelation was complete. The alliance was forged in truth and shared experience. The real war was about to begin. 3 years can be an eternity or an eye blink, depending entirely on what fills them. For Ethan Cross, who had counted 100 years in absolute silence, 3 years of genuine purpose passed like water through desperate fingers. For Lyra Ashford, who had spent her entire life in the cold discipline of doctrine, training 3 years of authentic human connection, felt like learning to breathe for the first time after a lifetime of suffocation. The engineering bay of Arc 7 had transformed into something between a sacred cathedral and a cutting-edge workshop, a vast chamber where rigorous science and desperate faith merged into humanity's last fragile hope. Holographic schematics floated in the air like three-dimensional constellations, each one representing a piece of the weapon that was not truly a weapon, the instrument that would either save humanity or condemn it to final absolute erasure. Kira Hartwell stood before the primary holographic display, her platinum hair tied back in a practical ponytail, her pale fingers conducting an invisible orchestra of cascading data streams. She had visibly aged in these 3 intense years, fine lines appearing at the corners of her eyes, but there was something profoundly new in her expression. Earned purpose. Not the hollow certainty of unquestioned doctrine, but the hard-won confidence of someone who had been catastrophically wrong and learned from the experience. The resonance chamber is finally complete. She reported, her voice carrying clearly across the bay to where Vex Sterling supervised the installation of sophisticated defensive systems. Arc 6 in Virginia had the key component we were missing. They were researching dimensional harmonics before the breach. The underlying mathematics are elegant, almost beautiful in their simplicity. Vex looked up from the weapons console, her scarred face thoughtful in the blue glow of holographic displays. She had traded her combat fatigues for an engineer's practical jumpsuit, though she still moved with the coiled readiness of a warrior perpetually prepared for violence. Beautiful does not necessarily mean effective, she observed pragmatically. Can it actually do what we need? In theory, absolutely, Kira replied carefully. But theory and practice have a demonstrated tendency to diverge dramatically when you are trying to communicate with an entity from another dimension using emotional frequencies. At the center of the engineering bay, the Harmony engine rose like a sculpture carved from solidified light and mathematical impossibility. It was not particularly large, barely 15 feet tall, but it radiated a sense of profound significance that had nothing to do with physical dimensions. The core was a perfect sphere of crystalline lattice that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states, surrounded by 12 organic cradles arranged in a geometrically perfect circle. Each cradle was precisely keyed to a specific emotional frequency designed to convert raw human consciousness into something that could bridge the gap between dimensions. Lyra Ashford walked the circumference of the engine slowly, one hand trailing thoughtfully along the smooth surfaces, feeling the vast potential thrumming beneath her fingertips like a heartbeat. Through her permanent quantum link with Ethan, she could sense his presence in the observation deck 50 feet above, could feel his complex mixture of hope and fear, as he watched her examine their desperate creation. "You are worried," she said aloud, knowing he would hear through their bond, even though he was physically distant. His voice came not through her ears, but directly into her mind, as warm and familiar as her own heartbeat. "I am always worried. 100 years of solitude teaches you to expect the worst possible outcomes. And 3 years of genuine connection should have taught you to hope for the best," she replied, smiling despite the crushing weight of what lay ahead. She felt his presence move, and a moment later he was beside her in the bay, having descended via one of the Ark's internal transport systems. His hand found hers automatically, fingers intertwining with practiced ease, and the simple touch sent a cascade of shared sensation through their link. She felt his pride in what they had built together. He felt her fierce determination to see it through to whatever end awaited them. "The test subject arrived early this morning," Ethan said, gesturing toward a specialized containment chamber at the far end of the bay. "Small fragment, maybe a cubic meter of active void material. We captured it from the Montana perimeter 3 months ago at significant cost." Inside the transparent containment chamber, darkness moved with terrible purpose. Not shadow, which is merely the absence of light, but the absence of reality itself. The void fragment writhed like something alive, though it possessed no biology, no cellular structure, nothing that could be called life in any conventional sense. It simply existed, and in existing, it consumed. The chamber's quantum containment field was the only thing preventing it from unmaking everything it touched. "Are we ready?" Lyra asked quietly. Ethan looked at the Harmony engine, at the 12 cradles that would soon hold human souls merged into unified purpose. "We will never be truly ready, but we are completely out of time." "The main mass is moving. Chronos probe detected significant motion 2 days ago. If our projections are accurate, we have maybe 6 months before it reaches populated areas. 6 months to perfect technology that barely exists. 6 months. Half a year to perfect a technology that barely existed, to teach an alien intelligence a completely new way of being, to save what remained of a world that had already lost so much." "Then we test now," Lyra said firmly. They assembled a skeleton crew for the initial test, not the full 12, just 4. Lyra and Ethan in the central cradles, their permanent bond making them ideal conductors. Kira and Vex in supporting positions. It was dangerous to attempt a partial activation, but full deployment without any testing was suicide. Lyra settled into her cradle, feeling it adjust to her body like a living organism responding to familiar presence. Across from her, Ethan did the same, and through their link, she felt his fear spike sharply. Not fear of death, which he had made peace with long ago. Fear of failure, fear that after everything, after a century of waiting and 3 years of desperate work, they would prove inadequate to the task. "Hey," she said softly, catching his ancient eyes. "We are not alone anymore. Remember." He smiled, and in that smile she saw the ghost of the man he had been before a century of loneliness had carved him hollow. "I remember." The engine hummed to life with building power. Golden light flowed up from the cradles like warm water, defying gravity. And Lyra felt the now familiar sensation of her consciousness expanding, reaching out to touch Ethan's, then Kira's analytical precision, then Vex's warrior discipline. 4 separate minds becoming one composite awareness unified in desperate purpose. Together they shaped the resonance with careful intention. Not words or images, which were too crude for what they needed, but pure emotional frequency, a harmonic pattern that encoded human experience into something that could cross dimensional barriers. They wove together joy and sorrow, love and loss, hope and despair, creating a tapestry of what it meant to be human, to be conscious, to be connected rather than alone. And they broadcast it directly at the void fragment. For a long moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. The darkness continued to writhe, continued to hunger, continued to be exactly what it had always been since the dawn of its existence. Then it paused. The motion stopped completely. The fragment held perfectly still, as if listening to something it had never heard before in eons of existence. And slowly and possibly, the color began to change. Black fading gradually to gray-gray, softening to blue-blue, brightening to something almost luminous and peaceful. The fragment was not gone, but it was calm, sated. Not by consuming, but by connecting. Lyra felt tears streaming down her face as they carefully withdrew from the fusion. It worked. The theory was sound. They could teach the void a different way of being. Phase 1 successful. Kira reported her voice shaking with something that might have been hope reborn. The fragment has completely stabilized. No decay, no aggression, no hunger. It is simply existing, peacefully. Vex stared at the now blue fragment, her expression unreadable. We just taught entropy to be calm. I genuinely do not know whether to be terrified or amazed. Both, Ethan said quietly, helping Lyra from her cradle with gentle hands. Definitely both. That night in the quarters they shared, Lyra and Ethan stood before the transparent window, watching stars that seemed too bright, too clear, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. His arms wrapped around her from behind his chin, resting on her shoulder, and through their link they shared not thoughts, but simple presence. Being together, being not alone. I laughed today, Ethan said suddenly. Did you notice? Lyra smiled warmly. I did. Kira made a terrible joke about probability matrices, and you actually laughed. A real laugh, not polite, just genuine amusement. First time in 103 years, he mused. You taught me that. How to be in the moment instead of the past. You taught me how to feel without fear, she replied, turning in his arms to face him directly. Fair trade, I think. He kissed her, then soft and slow and deep, and through their bond the sensation doubled, tripled, became something beyond merely physical. They felt each other's joy, each other's desire, each other's deep abiding gratitude for this impossible second chance at being human. But even in that moment of hard-won peace, they both felt the distant tremor. Something stirring in the north. Something waking from a sleep that had lasted far too long. The alert came 3 days later, shattering the fragile peace. The Kronos probe station, positioned at the Montana-Canada border to monitor the original breach site, transmitted a final desperate burst of data before going completely silent. The message was simple and terrifying. Movement detected. Mass displacement. The void is waking. Within hours, satellite imagery confirmed what the sensors had detected. The Montana Rift, sealed for 70 years by quantum field generators maintained from Arc 4, was expanding rapidly. The containment was catastrophically failing. And inside that expanding darkness, something vast and ancient and incomprehensibly hungry was stirring, drawn by the Harmony engine test, like a predator catching scent of prey. The War Council convened in Arc 7's command center. Representatives from all 7 arcs, connected via a holographic link, filled the room with ghostly blue light. Military commanders, scientists, former Doctrine operatives now serving the Sentinel Alliance. 5,000 souls unified in desperate purpose, but divided in methodology. General Carver, commander of the remnant U.S. military forces, spoke first. His weathered face filled the hologram, his voice carrying decades of combat experience. We have 12,000 combat-ready troops within striking distance. Heavy armor, artillery, enough concentrated firepower to level entire mountain ranges. I say we establish a defensive perimeter around the Montana site and hit it with everything we have. You will feed it, Ethan said quietly from his position beside Lyra. The void does not consume matter or energy in ways you understand. It consumes information, complexity, organized pattern. Every weapon you fire, every sophisticated system you deploy, just makes it stronger. You would be providing fuel to a fire. Then what do you propose? Carver demanded. We sit back passively and let it consume the continent. Kira stepped forward, her interface projecting data into the shared holographic space. Comprehensive analysis of the void's movement patterns suggests it is not randomly aggressive. It is searching. The test we ran 3 days ago created a signal, a concentrated burst of emotional information. The void detected it. It is coming here, to Arc 7. A ripple of alarm passed through the council. Coming here meant coming to the heart of the Alliance, to the most densely populated refuge, to the seat of humanity's last stand. Let it come, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt through her link with Ethan. We built the Harmony engine for exactly this. Not to fight the void, but to communicate with it, to teach it a different way of existing. Teach it what? Someone demanded. How to be a friendly apocalypse. How to connect without consuming, Ethan replied. Kira's analysis is correct. The void is searching. But not for prey. For contact. It has been alone in its dimension for eons beyond our comprehension. When it crosses into our reality, it experiences consciousness, complexity, connection for the first time in its existence. But the only way it knows to interact is to absorb, to unmake and integrate. We can teach it another way. Vex Sterling, who had been silent until now, spoke up. And if you are wrong, if it cannot learn, then we are no worse off than if we fight it conventionally, Ethan said. Except we will have tried something genuinely new, something that might actually work instead of feeding it. The vote was close, but ultimately fragile hope won over familiar fear. The Harmony Protocol was authorized. ARC-7 would become ground zero not for a conventional battle, but for an attempted conversation with cosmic horror. They had 6 days to prepare, 6 days to recruit the full crew of 12. 6 days to say necessary goodbyes and make peace with the very real possibility that they were about to unmake themselves in a failed experiment. On the 3rd day, a transport arrived from ARC-4 in Alaska. Thorne Ashcroft stepped out into Colorado sunlight, looking like a woman who had walked through purifying fire and emerged tempered rather than broken. After the broadcast that shattered the doctrine, she had retreated to ARC-4 Alaska, not in punishment, but in penance, self-imposed. 3 years spent not hiding from judgment, but learning to forgive herself. 3 years weathering her shame in solitude, rebuilding faith not in rigid doctrines, but in fallible people. 3 years that had carved her into something new. She wore civilian clothes, not doctrine uniform, and carried only a small pack. Lyra met her in the landing bay, and for a long moment that stretched between them, the sisters simply looked at each other across distance that was both physical and emotional. "You came," Lyra said finally. "You called," Thorne replied simply. "Through the link. I felt your fear, your need. I could not ignore it." They had maintained minimal contact over the 3 years, occasional careful messages, slow, painful reconciliation. The wound of Thorne's initial rejection had healed, but left scars that both women navigated carefully. "I do not expect forgiveness," Thorne continued. "I led you into darkness based on lies I refused to question. Nearly destroyed everything worth preserving. But if you will have me, I want to help. I want to do something right for once." Lyra crossed the distance between them and pulled her sister into an embrace. "You were wrong," she said softly, "but you were trying to protect people. The method was catastrophically flawed. The heart was not." Thorne's arms came up slowly to return the embrace, and through their touch, Lyra felt the crushing weight her sister carried. Guilt, shame, desperate need for redemption. She sent warmth through the contact acceptance forgiveness earned through 3 years of Thorne working to undo the damage she had caused. "The void is coming," Lyra said, pulling back to meet her sister's eyes. "We are going to try to talk to it, to teach it. It is probably suicide. But we could use someone with your tactical mind to coordinate defenses, to buy us time if things go wrong." Thorne's expression hardened into something like her old commander's mask, but underneath Lyra felt fierce determination. "I know how to buy time. Show me the defensive perimeter." The Void reached Fort Harrison, a small military outpost 50 miles north of ARC-7 on the 5th day. 200 soldiers garrisoned there, good men and women who knew the risks and volunteered anyway to buy time for those behind them. They were equipped with experimental weapons designed to create localized distortion fields, to slow the Void's advance without feeding it complex information. The engagement lasted exactly 17 minutes. Satellite feeds showed the darkness flowing over the fortification, like water over stone, not destroying but absorbing. The soldiers did not die, which would have been a mercy. Death grants the dignity of having existed. They were unmade, their consciousness stripped away and integrated into the Void's mass. For those 17 terrible minutes, 200 individual minds screamed in a unified voice that Kira's sensors translated as a single repeating phrase. Alone, pain, need, alone, pain, need. Through their link, Lyra felt Ethan's horror, not at the tactical loss, but at the echo of his own century of isolation amplified 200 times over. She sent him warmth presence, a reminder that he was not alone, would never be alone again. But the ghost of those screams would haunt them both. When the darkness finally receded, Fort Harrison was gone. Not destroyed in any conventional sense, just absent. A perfect circle of absolute nothing where buildings and people had been reality itself erased like chalk from a board. In ARC-7's command center, Kira worked frantically at her console, analyzing the data stream from the engagement. Her fingers flew across the interface, running decryption algorithms on the void's emanations, searching desperately for patterns in the chaos. "It is communicating," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "Not intentionally, perhaps, but its movements, its energy, signatures, they are structured. Language, or something functionally similar to language. It is in pain." Ethan moved to her side, studying the scrolling data. Through his link with Lyra, she felt his sudden flash of understanding, of recognition. "It is like me," he said quietly. 100 years alone felt like eternity, but for the void it has been actual eons, eternity in isolation. It learned hunger as the only way to feel connection, even if only by erasing what it touches. It does not know any other way of existing. "Then we teach it," Lyra said, her voice carrying to every corner of the command center. "That is what the Harmony engine is for. We show it connection without consumption. We give it what it has been searching for across dimensions and eons." Thorne stood at the tactical display, watching the void's projected path with professional assessment. 43 miles away, moving slowly but inexorably. 30 hours until it reached ARC-7's perimeter. "I can hold the defensive line," she said. "Give you as much time as possible. But you need to be ready, because if this does not work, there will be no second chance." The 12 cradles of the Harmony engine filled over the next 24 desperate hours. Lyra and Ethan took the central positions, their permanent bond making them ideal conductors. Around them, volunteers arranged themselves, each chosen to represent a specific emotional frequency. Joy. A young man named Marcus, who had never lost his ability to find wonder in small things despite living through the breach. Sorrow. An elderly woman named Grace who had lost 3 children but found meaning in grief instead of bitterness. Love. Fear. Hope. Loneliness. Curiosity. Courage. Grief. Peace. Connection. Forgiveness. 12 souls. 12 facets of human experience. 12 voices that would merge into one cosmic song. The void reached ARC-7's perimeter at dawn. Thorne's defensive positions lit up like fireworks, EMP grenades creating localized distortion fields that slowed but did not stop the advancing darkness. Vex's battalions fell back in perfectly coordinated retreat, buying minutes with discipline and sacrifice. In the command center, Kira watched her sister execute a flawless defensive withdrawal, pride and fear warring in her chest. "All units falling back to final positions," she reported. "The void is 1 kilometer out. Projected contact in 8 minutes. At the blast doors to the Ark's core, Thorne Ashcroft stood at manual override, her hands on controls that would seal the entrance if everything failed catastrophically. Around her, the last defensive line held position weapons ready, but everyone knowing they were symbolic gestures against an enemy that transcended violence. 7 minutes, Kira's voice crackled over comms. In the Harmony chamber, golden light flooded the cradles as the engine powered up to full capacity. Lyra felt Ethan's consciousness touch hers with familiar warmth, then expand to encompass the other 10, weaving them together into a tapestry of unified awareness. She had done this before in small scale, but this was total. 12 minds becoming one composite, being greater than the sum of parts. She felt Marcus's joy at sunrise over mountains, Grace's sorrow at children's graves visited every Sunday, the fierce protective love of a mother named Sarah, the cold terror of a soldier named James facing death without flinching, hope stubborn and unreasonable from a scientist named David, loneliness from a widow named Catherine that echoed Ethan's century, curiosity bright and burning from a student named Amy, courage from a firefighter named Thomas who had walked into flames to save strangers, grief, peace, connection, forgiveness. All of it wove together, harmonized, unified into a single frequency that encoded what it meant to be human in all its messy, beautiful complexity. 5 minutes, Kira reported, her voice shaking now. The composite awareness shaped the signal with desperate care. Not words or images, which were too limited. Pure emotional resonance broadcast on dimensional frequencies that the void could perceive. They sang a song of loneliness answered by connection, of hunger satisfied by sharing instead of consuming, of eternity made bearable by presence. 3 minutes, Kira whispered. The void touched the Ark's outer shell, and alarm screamed. Quantum shields flickered and strained as unreality pressed against them, testing, probing, seeking weakness. 2 minutes. Through the composite awareness, Lyra felt the void's confusion like a physical force. It had crossed dimensions expecting to find sustenance, prey something to unmake and absorb. Instead, it found something reaching out, not to fight, not to flee, but to connect. 1 minute. The song intensified. 12 souls pouring themselves completely into the signal, broadcasting everything they were, everything humanity could be, directly into the incomprehensible vastness of the void's consciousness. And the void paused. The advancing darkness stopped. The tendrils that had been writhing violently against the shields grew still. And in the terrible silence, something like awareness flickered in the depths of unreality. Contact. The response came not in words, but in raw emotions so powerful it nearly shattered the composite consciousness. Loneliness. Not the human loneliness of months or years, or even a century. Eons of isolation. Eternity as the only consciousness in a dimension of endless nothing. Hunger born of desperate need to feel anything, to touch any awareness that was not its own endless self. Pain, not physical, existential. The pain of being utterly, completely alone since before time had meaning. And underneath it all, a question. Wordless, but absolutely clear. Can you teach me to be less hungry? Through the composite awareness, Lyra shaped an answer. Not refusal or pity, but welcome. Recognition of one lonely thing calling to another across an impossible gulf. Stay, she sent. Learn from us. We will teach you connection. Real connection. Not consumption, but conversation. Not erasing, but understanding. Not alone, but together. The void shuddered and its color began to change. Black fading to deep blue, blue lightening to cyan, cyan, brightening to something almost luminous and peaceful. The hunger was still there, would perhaps always be there like an addict's craving, but tempered now by possibility, by hope that it could interact without destroying. In the command center, Kira stared at her sensors in complete disbelief. The hostile readings are dropping rapidly. Energy signature is fundamentally shifting. I think it is actually working. At the blast doors, Thorne watched through cameras as the advancing darkness receded like tide pulled by the moon, pulling back from the Ark's defenses. Not fleeing in defeat, settling, like a wild thing learning to be gentle. Confirm retreat, she ordered, her voice rough with emotion she usually kept buried. All units hold position. Do not engage unless directly attacked. In the Harmony Chamber, the 12 souls began to separate the composite consciousness, fragmenting back into individuals. Lyra felt Ethan's presence solidify beside her. Felt the others drift away, like boats separating after being tied together, each carrying a piece of the shared experience they would never forget. She opened her eyes to find him looking at her, tears streaming down his weathered face. Through their bond, she felt his overwhelming relief, his gall, his disbelief that after everything they had succeeded. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Ethan corrected gently. "You brought them here. You convinced them. You made connection possible. I just waited 100 years for you to arrive." Around them, the other 10 volunteers emerged from their cradles dazed and permanently transformed. They had touched something beyond human comprehension, and it had touched them in return. They would never be quite the same. Outside, the void settled around Arc 7 like a protective shroud. Not threatening, just present. Learning to exist near consciousness without consuming it. Learning to be something other than endless hunger. The war was over before it truly began, but the real work was only starting. 6 months later, the world had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The entity formerly known as the Void had been renamed the Nexus, a term that felt less hostile, more descriptive of what it had become. A bridge between dimensions. A consciousness learning painstakingly to interact through connection rather than consumption. It fed still but differently now. Volunteers across the 7 arcs offered memories, experiences, pieces of themselves freely given, like communion. The Nexus absorbed these gifts gratefully, and in return shared fragments of its own impossible existence. Humans learned what it felt like to exist in dimensions without time or space. The Nexus learned what it meant to laugh, to cry, to feel sunrise on skin. The seven arcs had become knowledge centers, their doors open wide to anyone seeking to understand the technology that had been hidden for so long. Thorne Ashcroft, once commander of the faithful, now served as chief ambassador, teaching former Doctrine operatives and curious civilians alike about the difference between faith built on fear and trust built on evidence and experience. Vex Sterling trained the new Sentinel Defense Force not to fight the void, but to protect the fragile peace, to defend against human threats and the inevitable chaos of a world slowly rebuilding. Kira Hartwell mapped the interconnected systems of all seven arcs, decoding technologies that would help humanity heal the deep scars left by the breach. Atmospheric processors to clean poisoned air, quantum field generators to stabilize reality, biotechnology that could regrow forests and restore oceans. Morrison, the former Doctrine director, now served in Arc 1 Arizona as chief historian, documenting the mistakes that had led to a century of violence. He was old now, weathered by guilt, but his meticulous records would ensure future generations understood the cost of certainty without evidence. The 10 volunteers who had joined Lyra and Ethan in the Harmony engine had dispersed across the seven arcs, each one forever changed by touching cosmic consciousness. Marcus taught children about finding joy in Arc 3. Grace counseled the grieving in Arc 5. They were living bridges between human and something vaster, witnesses to the moment when hunger learned to become connection. The other 6 Guardians had emerged from their time stasis chambers after the crisis passed, blinking in the light of a changed world. 5 chose to remain as archivists, continuing their original mission. The 6th, a woman named Rebecca, who had guarded Arc 2 in Virginia, married a former Doctrine operative and opened a school teaching dimensional mathematics to children who would grow up knowing both worlds. Even loneliness, it seemed, could find company, given enough time and courage. And in Arc 7 and quarters that had become a true home, Lyra Ashford stood before the window watching sunrise paint Colorado gold and pink. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, feeling new life growing there, a child who would be born into a world forever changed, a world learning to be whole again. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind his hand, covering hers on their child, and through their permanent bond, she felt his wonder. After more than a century of death and preservation, the prospect of new life was almost too much to comprehend. "What will we tell them?" Lyra asked softly. "When they are old enough to ask." "What will we say about all this?" "The truth," Ethan replied without hesitation. "That their parents were weapons who chose to become bridges. That humanity faced extinction and chose connection over violence. That the universe is vast and strange and sometimes terrifying, but it is less frightening when you are not alone." Through the window they watched the Nexus create auroras over the mountains, beautiful curtains of light in colors that had no names visible, manifestations of an alien intelligence expressing something like joy. It had learned from them, and in learning had taught them something profound in return. That loneliness, whether experienced for 3 years or 3 eons, could be healed by reaching out. That hunger could be satisfied by sharing instead of taking. That the gap between alien and human was not as wide as fear suggested. "I found what I was guarding," Ethan said quietly, his lips brushing her temple. "After more than a century, I finally understand what the archive was really protecting. Not data, not technology, people, connection, the future." "And I found what I was missing," Lyra replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Purpose that is mine, not imposed. Love that is chosen, not forbidden. A life that is lived, not merely endured." They kissed as the sun rose higher. 2 souls permanently intertwined, no longer alone, no longer waiting. Around them, the arc hummed with life and purpose. Above them, the Nexus painted the sky with impossible colors. Ahead of them, a child who would grow up in a world learning to be whole again. The last Sentinel had found his relief at last. The weapon had become a bridge. And in the space where darkness had threatened to consume everything, light had taken root and grown toward tomorrow. Outside, dawn broke over a world that had learned the hardest lesson. That survival was not about building walls, but about opening doors. Not about fighting the unknown, but about finding the courage to say hello. And in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, shared through an unbreakable bond, Ethan and Lyra held each other and smiled, knowing that after everything, against all odds, they had taught the universe to sing. The end was a beginning. The darkness had learned to dream of light. And 2 people who had been alone had found in each other the thing worth more than mere survival. They had found home.